Hey guys, it's Danconia. Welcome back to the Overwatch League Roundup 2020. It felt odd doing that intro without the little bit on the end. Anyway, the Overwatch League is waiting on its grand finals to take place between the 8th and 11th of October. So, we are going to be doing some content during the period in which we are waiting to basically either look back on the season we've had so far, or look ahead to those grand finals. It's going to be super interesting and I have some stuff planned. But today I'm going to do the video that I promised a little while back at the end of the regular season, where we are going to look back at the team of the week from this whole season. So I have an Excel spreadsheet that has every single team of the week in it. And what it does is it adds up all the numbers, and then we can see how many times each team has featured in Team of the Week this season. And it's sort of eye-opening. Probably I'm going to regret making this video because a lot of people are going to call me biased, but it's going to be interesting nonetheless, I think, anyway, to take a look at this. So, you will notice when you look at this that there are a few gaps, a few weeks where there are some missing. And I will explain why they are there as we move through these weeks. So, we started off obviously in week 1. There was no team of the week in week 1 because this format didn't actually exist back then. It was a format where I picked the 5 best players. And the reason I changed it is because it ended up being quite a majority of DPS players. And I don't think that's great. And I thought Team of the Week was a nice idea, so in week 2 we brought in Team of the Week. It was pretty interesting. There is also a break in week 6 and week 7. This was obviously when the coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic caused a lot of issues, and it caused 2 weeks of play to be postponed. So there were no Team of the Weeks because there were no matches to actually take a look at. Then we move all the way to week 16, 17 and 18. So this was during the May Melee. Now I was planning on doing a Team of the Week for the May Melee, but I was ill and I was in hospital, so I didn't have time to do it. So that's the reason there was nothing in week 16. Week 17 and week 18 was a 2-week break after the May Melee, so there were no fixtures. The only other break is week 23, where we had a week's break after the Summer Showdown. So that's the reason that there is no Team of the Week for that week. But the rest of the weeks we have all of the Team of the Weeks to talk about, so let's get into it. Team of the Week properly started during week 2. This was when we were heavily during the homestands, the only homestands we got to see between week 2 and week 5. And this was when we only saw a certain amount of teams. So we hadn't seen any of the APAC teams yet. Well, actually, the APAC in NA didn't exist at this point, so we did actually see London. But we didn't see teams like Shanghai or Chengdu, people like that, the Asian teams generally, because they were in Asia getting ready for their games, and then the whole thing kind of exploded with COVID-19. So they got delayed quite heavily. So we don't see people like Shanghai, Seoul, Hangzhou, Guangzhou, Chengdu. They don't feature in these early matches. We see more of the NA-based teams. We see more of the European-based teams. So week 2 was heavily dominated by the Philadelphia Fusion. They did very, very, very well. And they also dominated week 3 because they did very well as well. Philadelphia Fusion really popped off in the early days. And they are a team throughout this season that have demonstrated a very high amount of individual skill. I think they have some of the biggest individual skill or highest individual skill ceilings in this entire league when you go on a player-by-player basis. So yeah, that's what I want to say about the Philadelphia Fusion, because they're going to feature a lot during this video. We also saw a lot of the Paris Eternal. This was when Paris Eternal were finding their feet, but this is when the Paris Eternal didn't have Xe. Xe was not eligible yet, and Hanbin had only just become eligible. In week 2, the Paris Eternal struggled because they had to play double main tank, because they didn't have Hanbin because he was ineligible, and Smex, unfortunately, has been a terrible year for that guy, and I wish him all the best still in his recovery because he got COVID-19 and he had heart valve surgery. So he has had a really unfortunate year. He is still on the Paris Eternal, and I hope that he can make it back very, very soon, because it's someone I really want to see in the league. Anyway, I'm going off the tangent. This meant that we saw No Smite and Bembest alongside each other for the Paris Eternal. And it didn't work out too well in week 2, but in week 3 onwards they brought in Hanbin. Hanbin was really good when he first came in. He got Team of the Week twice in his first 2 weeks, and we saw a lot of FD God, Hip when he was still at the Paris Eternal, Grey as well we saw in the early days. And we saw some of the Houston Outlaws players come in as well. Jexa, I remember him popping off on Kings Row. And Meko, obviously one of the standout players for the Houston Outlaws, despite their rough season. And we saw London. And during these early weeks, London looked like they showed promise because they actually played very well against the New York Excelsior team, had their very own homestand. And they managed to get tight victories over Florida, Washington, and I think Houston. So they were looking good, and they were looking good with their mechanics as well. Glister got a Team of the Week during that period. Shawfall also got a Team of the Week during that period for Toronto Defiant. Stratus, when he was at Washington Justice, again, he was popping off. And then XE came in week 5 and automatically went into the Team of the Week because he popped off on his first day. Very, very interesting. Popo for the Atlanta Reign we saw as well. And this is when we start to see Alarm come in for the Philadelphia Fusion and how good he's been. In the first 4 weeks, we saw Alarm get Team of the Week twice. So, yeah, Alarm has been good. Alarm has been really good this season. So then we take a 2-week break, and then coming back at week 8, we see the restructure of the league into APAC and NA, and we see some of the Asian teams come in. This is when we see Seoul Dynasty for the first time, the new look Seoul Dynasty, and they really make waves on that double barrier. We see Gesture and Marvel and Toby all come in for Team of the Week. Very, very interesting. We get to see San Francisco Shocking week 9, see Choi Hyobin come in, we see Shanghai and Lee Jae-gon come in for the main support role. And we're still seeing great play from the likes of the Philadelphia Fusion and the Paris Eternal. So it's really, really interesting. In week 10, we see the first Dallas Fuel player appear on the Team of the Week rosters and the first Guangzhou player. So this is when more teams are coming in. This was Doha for the Dallas Fuel, and this was Rio for the Guangzhou Charge. So those were really interesting ones. In week 9, we also saw the first Gladiators player in OG. Then we come to week 11, and we see the first Florida Mayhem player. This is when Florida Mayhem started to kind of grind with this Ash Tracer gameplay, and we saw BQB pop off. So BQB got a place here. We also saw Luffy for the Shanghai Dragons, and for the first time we saw Moth this season as well for the San Francisco Shock, and Meng, the ball god that he is. He got his place on Team of the Week, and I don't believe it was the only time, so he'll be popping up a little bit later on. Then during weeks 12 and 13, we saw a lot of Philadelphia Fusion, a lot of NYXL as well, Hotba showing one of his better performances this year, as well as Jonak. We saw Fury, we saw Funny Astro again, we saw Alarm again, and we saw Carpe. Fearless, though, started to pop off for the Shanghai Dragons in the main tank role, getting the Team of the Week main tank spot for 2 weeks running. And he would feature a lot more during the rest of the season. Fearless really has been a revelation this season in that main tank role after being that 0-40 main tank for the Shanghai Dragons way back when. And he's definitely looked much better than Stand 1, which we saw Shanghai experiment with a lot during the early part of the season. And this is also the first point where we see our MVP Fletter get a Team of the Week spot as well. Now, moving on, in week 14, things started to change up a little bit. Guangzhou started to get better. We saw more Guangzhou. We saw more San Francisco Shock in week 15 as well. And then we moved into the main melee where we see a little bit of a gap. Now, after this, obviously, we had a little bit of a meta shift. And then we saw some more teams come in. Take note, in week 15, it was the first time we saw Hangzhou Spark in the Team of the Week. So then we moved into week 19. This was when the next Team of the Week was, where we see the Gladiators. We see Fearless once again come in for this Team of the Week, and BQB pick up the second one for the Florida Mayhem. Sparkle. This is when we see Sparkle enter the league. He finally becomes eligible to play, being old enough, and he makes waves. This is when we go into the Genji meta, and this was beautiful to watch. This was Sparkle being Sparkle. This is what Sparkle is known for, and he got a Team of the Week place for it. He also got a Team of the Week place in week 21 as well, and this is where we start to see Krong popping off for the Guangzhou Charge. Krong on the Sigma was quite something to behold. Really, really good, and Krong not only got a Team of the Week spot for off-tank in week 21, but he also got it for the APAC week 22 Summer Showdown Team of the Week as well, which was dominated by Guangzhou Charge. This was when the Guangzhou Charge were at their very height of their power this season. They fell off towards the end, And not gonna lie, after this point, after the Week 22 APAC Summer Showdown Team of the Week, Guangzhou Charge would not feature again for the rest of the season in Team of the Week. So that's unfortunate, and it shows that sometimes some teams are not as adaptable in terms of metas. But during that Week 22, we saw Shu, Krong, Happy, and Eileen all in it. And guess what? Fearless popped up once again. Also, during Week 20 and Week 21, we saw the London Spitfire return to the Team of the Week. They started to get a little bit better. They started to look like they showed promise. We hadn't seen the London Spitfire feature in Team of the Week since Week 3 when it was Glister. This time in Week 20 it was Babel. He made some waves coming in on the Widowmaker. A very passive Widowmaker style, but it worked. And then highly on that flex support in Week 21. That was probably London's heyday this season. It was kind of downhill from there. But there's still promise in that team. It's just a lot of work to do. So, and then we obviously had the two separate Team of the Weeks. We've already talked about the APAC one. And then in NA, it was dominated by the Philadelphia Fusion and the Paris Eternal. This was when we had that crazy match between those two teams. We saw XE popping off and we saw EQO on the Genji. And one of the greatest clutches of all time, probably, from EQO on Genji. It was a crazy, crazy week, that one. And probably some of the best tournament we've seen in a long, long time. And we haven't even seen the grand finals yet. But then we had a break after the Summer Showdown. And then we moved into the sort of run-in at this point. You're starting the run-in to the end of the league. In Week 24, we saw the Florida Mayhem return again with Gangnam Jin in the support role, the flex support role. Gangnam Jin has actually been really, really good for the Florida Mayhem this season. He also would feature again in Week 26 as Team of the Week. Also, we saw Jexa return for the Houston Outlaws. We didn't see Jexa since Week 3, and we hadn't seen the Houston Outlaws feature since Week 10. So this is a great step for the Houston Outlaws, and again, this would be the last time that they would feature. Also, we saw Hanbin come back, we saw Bembes come back. This was some great play. Also, Birdring started to really find his feet at the Los Angeles Gladiators. This is when Birdring started to get much more powerful and started to pop off. Also, yes, Week 24 was the week where we saw Super in Team of the Week, and he wasn't on main tank. Yes, he was on DPS. That was a thing that happened, and we haven't seen it since, and we may never see it again. Week 24, 2020 Overwatch League Team of the Week is a unique one, possibly. So, note it in your diary. The next week was Week 25, where we saw the Chengdu Hunters come to life in the APAC region. They would get 3 of the spots in Week 25, thanks to Yveltal, Among, and Leave. And we also saw Bianca come in for the New York Excelsior. It was a new look for New York, but it really helped, and it had improved a lackluster Mano this season, I would say, who hasn't looked the greatest alongside Hotbar. Bianca really did bring out the best in him, and once again we saw Violet as well, who has been a mainstay during this season as well. Week 26 again, as I said earlier, we saw Gangnam Jin again. We saw Alarm back in Fury. Gujue would finally get his place on Team of the Week for Hangzhou Spark. Gujue on that fantastic Winston. And then Fletter reappears, and he certainly was a great MVP candidate and definitely worthy of winning it all. He also got the APAC Week 27 Team of the Week, because Week 27 was obviously our final tournament. It was the Countdown Cup, and we saw fantastic play from the Shanghai Dragons. But also we saw in APAC the Hangzhou Spark get quite far, so this is why we see people like Mika and Architect come in for the Hangzhou Spark. Architect signing up with them after leaving the San Francisco Shock. Also Late Young on the Zarya for the Chengdu Hunters, as they did well, but it was dominated by Shanghai Dragons with Lucy, Fearless, and Fletter. And when we move over to NA, we saw BQB come back for the Florida Mayhem, a mainstay in Team of the Week for the Florida Mayhem this year, more than Yaki actually, which is quite surprising. And also we saw obviously the likes of Sado and Ivy from the Philadelphia Fusion, and Twilight and Choi Hyobin from the San Francisco Shock, two teams that did very well during that part. And in the last 2 weeks, we see some teams come to life. We see some teams don't actually play during those 2 weeks, like Chengdu Hunters and Houston Outlaws. But this is when we see Alarm come back in for the Philadelphia Fusion. Also, we see the Seoul Dynasty start to pop off against their London Spitfire, where we see Gesture and Profit we see Profit feature for the first time this season in the Team of the Week, and he certainly wasn't gonna hang around for long because he has been popping off in these playoffs, which are not counted in this, by the way. This is just a regular season. Also, we see Hisu for the first time for the Philadelphia Fusion, and then the last week we didn't say Philadelphia, so it was dominated by the Hangzhou Spark, who had very good displays. We also see Dallas Fuel in for only the second time this season in the name of Note, and an Animo for the NYXL, and San Francisco Shock with Violet featuring once again. But that's the entire Team of the Weeks for the entire season. So the question is, how does this add up? Well, I have all the numbers in front of me. There are 2 teams that did not get a single player in Team of the Week for the regular season. They are Boston and they are Vancouver. I don't think a lot of people will be too surprised about that. Boston did end up getting 1. It was Myung Bong in the playoffs. Vancouver will finish the season with no one in Team of the Week. It's not too surprising. Vancouver have had a very, very tough season, but they didn't manage to get anyone in the early days either when they had the runaway roster. So it's tough for them this season, but hopefully they can improve next season and get someone on there. Washington would only feature once, as they actually kind of popped off in the playoffs rather than the regular season. Then we get to teams like Toronto and Dallas Fuel, who have featured 2 times during Team of the Week. London, who have featured 3 times alongside Atlanta. Then we have Houston, who featured 4 times, which is very, very interesting. And I think it's slightly surprising to me that Houston featured more than London. I think that tells you the issue with consistency for London, definitely during this season. Then we make a jump to people who are on 6 appearances. This is the Gladiators, this is the Florida Mayhem, Chengdu Hunters, the Seoul Dynasty, because Seoul Dynasty weren't very good during the regular season, let's be honest. It was more during the playoffs that they really, really got to shine. It's actually quite fascinating, that, and it's something the Seoul Dynasty could work on, because they could have been so much better during the regular season. Also, this includes the Valiant on 6 as well. Hangzhou got 7, Guangzhou got 8. And also New York got 8 as well. So New York not quite up with the likes of the other teams, you know, pushing the echelons in terms of how many Team of the Weeks they got. But then this is then when we come to the top 4. So the top 4 are as follows. Funnily enough, in 4th is the Shanghai Dragons. And it's a weird one, because I think they got 14. And they are 3 behind the next place team in 3rd, which is Paris Eternal. And I think it's very telling. Shanghai Dragons are a team that has phenomenal team synergy and phenomenal teamwork. And very often it means that you see a lot of different players popping off. Generally, when you see a sort of trend with the Shanghai Dragons, like in the week 27 APAC result, Team of the Week, where they got 3 players in it. In week 12, where they got 2 players in it. There's kind of a theme, and it's generally that the Shanghai Dragons pop off as a team rather than popping off as individuals. And when I look at the top 3 teams, so Paris Eternal was 17. Paris Eternal, obviously, they have some very big pop-offs like XE and Sparkle, which are 2 players to note very, very obviously. And FD got as well, who is an incredibly good Lucio. They individually pop off at times, and they can do it quite often. Also, Paris Eternal were heavily helped out by the fact that they did so well early on, getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Team of the Week appearances in the first 4 weeks, which really, really helped them along in terms of getting ahead of Shanghai when Shanghai really weren't playing. So some teams have actually had a lot more time to build up Team of the Week appearances than others, even though they play the same amount of games, because it means they're playing in the same weeks, which means they're competing against each other. Whereas in the first 4 weeks, the Philadelphia Fusion and the Paris Eternal, most notably, weren't competing against the likes of Shanghai Dragons and San Francisco Shock for places, because those teams weren't playing. So that's something to note here. It's been an odd season in terms of that, because normally we would have seen pretty much every week all the teams playing. So that's kind of something to stand out here. In second, we have the San Francisco Shock, only 1 ahead of the Paris Eternal on 18. Again, a team with some very, very big individual pop-off potential. Something that has got the San Francisco Shock in terms of their numbers is their support line, without a doubt. We've seen a lot of Moth, we've seen a lot of Violet. Violet we've seen, I believe, 4 times in Team of the Week this year. Then we see Twilight once as well. And then you have the DPS as well. Like Ans has had 3 appearances. We saw Rascal. We saw Super. Yeah, Super DPS. So it's not necessarily the tank line always getting in there, which is kind of a surprise for the San Francisco Shock considering they have Choi Kyoben. But there have been better or more appearances from other off-tanks in the league this season, which I think is rather interesting. But the team that does top it out, and tops it out by quite a margin, is the Philadelphia Fusion at 26. So this is why I know I'm going to get slated in the comments for being biased. I'm not, I promise. I think there is a reason for this. And I said it at the start of the video. Philadelphia Fusion have, in my opinion, probably the highest individual skill cap in the league. So if you take them by a player-by-player basis, when you look at Funny Astro, when you look at Carpe, Sado, Fury, Poco, all of them, Alarm as well, I think their individual skill levels, their skill caps, are higher than some of the teams around them. I think Alarm can be better than Violet. I think Funny Astro is better than any main support on the San Francisco Shock. I think he's also better than FD God. I think he's one of the best main supports in the league, up against perhaps Lee Jae-gon. And what I've seen in recent weeks is I think Funny Astro may be better than Lee Jae-gon as well. So there's that to take into account. Then we have Carpe. We know Carpe's carry potential. We know the carry potential of actually the entire DPS line of the Philadelphia Fusion. I think some other teams can match that these days. But when I look at the tank line and support line, especially for the Philadelphia Fusion, I think their skill level, their skill cap is much higher than some of the other teams in the league. And that's why I think they've popped off more this season to get more Team of the Weeks. But there is that caveat to come back to. And that is week 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this is what can really sway these figures. Again, as I said just now for the Paris Eternal, Philadelphia Fusion were in the same boat. They weren't competing against the Shanghai Dragons or against the San Francisco Shock, or at that time against Vancouver Titans, who were tipped to be one of the best because they had the runaway roster. They weren't competing against those teams because they weren't playing, and they didn't feature until week 8 or 9. So, the Philadelphia Fusion had a head start, and they popped off in the early weeks. And I mentioned them, they got 8 Team of the Week appearances in 4 weeks. So, you take that 8 away, and they will be level with the San Francisco Shock. So, when you look at the Philadelphia Fusion being out ahead here, I want to say it is with a caveat. I'm not saying they don't deserve to be there. I'm saying they had a head start against some of the other teams in the league. And if we'd seen some of the big teams like during the early weeks, Vancouver, San Francisco, Shanghai, maybe Seoul, maybe Hangzhou, maybe Guangzhou, teams like that, then maybe the Philadelphia Fusion would not have got as many places as they did. And so they wouldn't have as many Team of the Week appearances, and they'd be spread out more across the top teams in the league, like Shanghai. You could perhaps take 3 off of Philadelphia, but give them to Shanghai. Take 1 or 2 off of Philadelphia, give them to San Francisco, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden, it becomes very even between Shanghai, San Francisco, and Philadelphia, who arguably are the top 3 teams in the league. So yeah. And there's the caveat of, what about Seoul? Well, Seoul didn't do very well during the regular season. I think everyone can probably agree with that. And they're a playoffs team. If they had played like they are playing in the playoffs the entire season, yes, the meta favours them, but if they played like that during the regular season, I think Seoul would have been right up there. Not going to lie. So that is it. That is the overview of Team of the Week this year. You are going to roast me in the comments for how many Philadelphia have got. But there is caveats to that. So please do bear in mind the early weeks and how they didn't have to compete against other big teams for spots in Team of the Week. And I hope this has been insightful. And I've really enjoyed Team of the Week this year. It's been a really different and new concept, and I think it's going to be really cool to continue it into 2021, which should be really interesting and hopefully a little bit more balanced with no COVID-19 issues. Hopefully we can get to back to homestands as well. But I'm going to leave it here for this one. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you'd like to give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.